Thank you, everybody, for joining us for Research and Discovery Grand Rounds today. We're going to get started in just a minute. We're going to give one more minute for a few more people to log in. So we're really excited today to introduce everybody in the Frontiers community to our clinical research units and how you can best take advantage of those Frontiers clinical research units. We have a number of people who work directly in the management of those units who are going to be talking about them, and then also some case use examples associated with the use of our clinical research units. We do have one conflict of interest is that Dr. Mark Hamlin, who will be talking about some of his work in the CRU, does have relationships to a number of companies, but I don't think that's going to influence the content of what he's actually going to be describing today. Next slide. And then make sure that you get a block out on your calendar for next month when Research and Discovery Grand Rounds will be talking about entrepreneurship. We'll be hearing from Scott Weir and Doug Bright about bridging the valley of death, or how to move discoveries into clinical practice through entrepreneurship. Okay, I think that's all of our slides, so make sure you've got that. We'll be introducing Dr. Mario Castro in just a minute to give an overview of the clinical research unit capacities, but I think that we'll start off by diving right into some of the clinical research unit capacity right here at KUMC. Laura, I'd like to introduce Laura Musselman, who I think is the director of the clinical research unit there, to get us started.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of the clinical and translational science units that we have here at Fairway, which is right off Shawnee Mission Parkway in Fairway, Kansas, and also at Rainbow, where the director there is Shelby Williams. She's the director on the Rainbow campus there, right in the hospital on Sudler, second floor. And then we'll have Children's Mercy speak to their clinical translational science unit and give a little bit more specifics about their pediatric unit. And then we also have a fourth unit at Wichita.
Laura, could you click on the screen presentation?
Yeah.
Yeah. Is
that good?
It's got the wrong version of it.
Yeah, I know. I think that's why I had it the other way.
Okay, you can go back.
Sorry. So our clinical translational science units really are here to support research and principal investigators who have different research projects. We have about over 120 different research studies here in Fairway going on, and we provide what I review as 3 different types of resources: skilled staff who are skilled in administering clinical trial protocols, very complex protocols. We have equipment. So we have, some expensive equipment here that we maintain and calibrate for researchers, and then we also have space. And you can utilize one of these or all 3 of these, depending on what your needs are for your clinical trial. We operate sort of on what people call a chargeback or a fee-for-service business model. So you send a protocol in and tell us what type of support that you're needing. And then we would build a budget for you and tell you how much these different things will cost to implement, such as an infusion, a blood draw, blood processing. But our goal as a CTSU, we're much aligned like a nonprofit. We're not here to make money. We're only here to sort of cover our expenses, and as in personnel, staff, and space. So we're really just here to sort of break even from a financial standpoint. We work individually with the investigators to build budgets and to look at your protocols and to implement them. So I talked a little bit about some of the resources to just show you show you on the screen some different resources that we have. But as far as clinical space, we have exam rooms, we have infusion suites. We even have here in Fairway an overnight space with a hospital bed for overnight observations. There's a metabolic kitchen. And negative pressure rooms. We have them here at Fairway and have conducted like some smoking cessation clinical trials in our negative pressure rooms. Places to collect blood, phlebotomy bays, obviously lab space, and storage. We have some limited storage, but we do have some space here for study teams to keep some of their items that they might have received from their sponsors, such as their ECG or some of their tubes and vials that they may need for their study. We also have space for the study coordinators to sit and computers to access. So while they're here, they can be working. Okay. We have a very complex laboratory, and so we keep a lot of expensive laboratory equipment on hand so that we can store specimens at -80 and freezers or a -20 freezer. We also have different types of analyzers, like a YSI analyzer that we utilize here in Fairway. And all this equipment we are responsible for maintaining, also ensuring that there's calibration so that those can be provided to sponsors as needed. And we keep all those records here on hand. We have here in Fairway, we have an exercise physiologist. And so we have an exercise physiology lab where we can conduct all types of different types of exercise physiology tests. We have a DEXA scanner so we can look at, bone density. We also have treadmills and recumbent cycles where we can do different types of fitness tests. So these are, we even have a tilt table test or tilt table available to conduct tilt table tests on. So we only offer that here in Fairway. And so that's why there's a little bit of differences in different types of clinical trials going on in the different units. We also have a couple specific labs here. We have a neuromuscular lab in our exercise physiology space, and we have small cardiovascular labs run by PIs. So we do have some other labs that are very specific to certain diseases and what they're studying. In Rainbow, they have pulmonology. So they have a very focused pulmonology unit there, and they have specific pulmonology equipment and testing that we don't have here at the Fairway campus. So most of our pulmonology studies are obviously happening at the Fairway campus. Like I said, we have staff, and those are a resource for you all to utilize. And so we have trained nurses, RNs, and nurse practitioners. We have trained medical assistants, and then we have obviously at Rainbow, there's a respiratory therapist, and then we also have physicians on staff to help with medical monitoring of the trials. So these are some of the different services that are offered at a clinical and translational science unit. We are available to place IVs, to run infusions, to draw bloods, to process those bloods, ECGs, all sorts of things here you can see on the slide of what we offer. And, any services that are needed, we will, like I said, create a budget and then have the study staff review that budget for approval. And we can do complex testing, especially in the exercise physiology lab, and we have IV glucose tolerance tests, oral glucose tolerance tests, and whatnot. People often ask, like, how do you get started with the CTSU? And so we do have a red cap form that basically you go out and can fill out to tell us what type of protocol you have, what kind of services you're looking for. And then from there, we can then start to draft out a budget of what the services that we would conduct here. Some investigators only want space. So we call that a space only visit. So they have trained staff who can do all the procedures. Their coordinators are very trained. So they just may need an exam room or a phlebotomy bay or an infusion space. So they may only request those type of services. Others need, our nurses to perform certain processes or procedures for them, and so they'll request those. So there's a process that we go through with the Research Institute and through my agreements to basically review your protocol. And then we also build out very complex flow sheets so that we know our staff are doing the processes in the order that they're needed. And we'll meet with you beforehand to make sure we have all those set up before we have our first participant on board. And then from there, we start scheduling participants. There are, like I mentioned briefly, other CTSUs. So we'll hear from Children's Mercy. We've got some people who are going to tell you about their experience and what they offer there at our Children's Mercy campus. And then also at Wichita. Wichita has a clinical trial unit. And all of the units also meet regularly to try to we're working towards collaborating, and so that we can make it more seamless, and also just so that processes will be very similar across the CTSUs. So if you go to Rainbow, you'll get a similar ECG as if you went to Wichita and whatnot. So we've been working together for months now to work on that process so that it will be smooth as we have multi-center trials that may need to utilize all of the CTSUs, that those processes will be very similar across units. And so that's all I have is a brief overview.
Yeah, and so folks can continue to type in questions in the chat. We'll may respond to some of those either in the chat, or we'll have some time at the end to discuss those. I think what we'd like to do is to get into some use case scenarios. How do people take advantage of using the clinical trial units? And we want to kick it off with Dr. Jill Morris from the Department of Neurology to talk with us about what she's been doing.
All right, can you guys see my slides? I'm not getting them to come up for some reason.
We are seeing them in some format or another. There, that's better. That's perfect.
All right. Okay. So thank you for the introduction. I am Jill Morris, and I am an assistant professor in the Department of Neurology. I'm just going to give a really brief overview of how I've benefited from CTSU resources over the last 10 years or so. So I've done studies that have used the CTSU in a very intensive manner, and also just for space only. So I'll kind of give some examples of all of that. As mentioned, I do a lot of work that's based on metabolism. And so it's very important to me to have really gold standard measures of things like glucose and lactate. The CTSU has a YSI 2500, as Laura mentioned, which is a gold standard biochemistry analyzer of these metabolites. I've leveraged the CTSU for glucose and meal tolerance testing, for biospecimen processing. I've done a variety of infusions at the CTSU. We've successfully done hyperinsulinemic euglycemic clamps with their trained nursing staff. And we have lactate clamps in startup, which is another unique physiological procedure that I'll talk about very briefly. Routinely, I've done body composition measures. The DEXA scan there provides things like regional measures of body composition in terms of visceral fat, fat mass, lean mass, bone mineral density, things like that. Exercise testing is a really great resource that a lot of my colleagues and I leverage at the CTSU Fairway campus. And then we actually have a heat therapy study. So I'll talk about that in a minute. Something that's kind of unique about the CTSU is that you can actually execute your study there, but also they're very supportive in terms of study development. So this is pre-COVID, that's why nobody's wearing masks, but you can see here that my staff actually piloted our blood collection procedures for an exercise study. We really needed to know exactly how much space we needed, how much, like what the timings would need to be, things like that. So we leveraged the space resources, the medical monitoring resources, and the laboratory resources there at the CTSU, which then we were able to get into a funded R01 that we actually deployed at the KU CCOP campus, where we do exercise actually in the room with a PET scanner. So it wasn't feasible for us to really develop that protocol there off site. We actually developed it at the CTSU Fairway and then deployed it. And then a couple of other studies that we have ongoing. We have a study called FIGHT-AD, which is actually heat therapy, where we've seen that you can actually improve metabolism and things like blood pressure with actual hot tub therapy. So that's available on the third floor of the CTSU in Fairway, and also exercise testing. You can see my senior research associate, Casey, looking over a graded exercise test. They have wonderful facilities there, great exercise physiologists to support that type of work. And then I have a study in startup called LEAN, where we're actually doing a lactate clamp, as I mentioned earlier. This involves a stable isotope infusion, really exposing someone to exercise without the exercise, specifically looking at the effects of lactate. And so it's really important because the CTSU Fairway is actually just one floor away from the KU Investigational Pharmacy. So we can really seamlessly get these isotopes made, bring them up, and then administer this very complex physiological procedure on participants. And this is Dr. Vidoni on my first subject on an insulin clamp study. So a lactate clamp is very similar with this type of setup. We're actually also able to do some cognitive testing in the same room because there's enough room in the area there for that. So just in summary, really excellent facilities. I always include CTSU in the environment of my grant applications. It's always looked upon favorably. They have great skilled nursing staff that can do everything from IV infusions to just basic phlebotomy. Gold standard equipment is available. DEXA, fitness testing, metabolic cart to measure resting metabolic rate, things like that. So I would just highly encourage investigators to use this really great resource because I definitely wouldn't be where I am without it.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. And it's nice to know that we can actually use the hot tub or the whirlpool to actually recruit participants into our studies. Great marketing technique. So I'd like to now turn it over to Dr. Mark Hamlin, Associate Professor in Internal Medicine, the Division of Pulmonary Medicine, to talk about, to expand on the diversity of resources that Laura alluded to at the beginning. Dr. Hamlin.
Thank you. So I run the interstitial lung disease clinic here at KU, and pulmonary fibrosis tends to be a rare disease. And so there's a lot of pharmaceutical research trials that are going on trying to find various treatments for the disease. And those, can run the spectrum from IV therapies, inhaled, oral, and some are certainly earlier phase studies, more intensive PK values. And one of the, challenges that I've found over the last decade, before the CTSU Rainbow was really kind of set up and running, is that the space here on campus to handle these various trials was a little bit fragmented. We had an IV therapy when the rheumatology's infusion center moved off campus. We really didn't have a place for patients to receive some IV therapies. And due to the nature of being pulmonary critical care and shifting job responsibilities and sometimes needing to cover the intensive care unit, and yet patient visits really not fluctuating with my schedule, it's something where it was not feasible for me to leave the campus and go over to CTSU Fairway, which was a big limiting factor in using that facility. It's a great facility. It's something where it just wasn't working for our research group. And additionally, it was something where we didn't have oxygen naturally set up over there. And so that was usually an added expense that had to be tacked on to trials if we did anything over there. And obviously my patient population is, a lot of them are, very oxygen dependent and sometimes very, very high oxygen flow rates where they can go through a tank of oxygen within an hour. And so not having those resources kind of built into the system over there provided some additional challenges. And so, previously we would it feel like we were doing research in almost a makeshift fashion. IV studies would sometimes be done up the 9th floor with the heart failure infusion clinic up there, where they're next to heart failure patients getting IV diuretics. Some of our, oral therapies, we'd be down in Dr. Moriarty's lipid clinic, mixed in with some of the lipid patients getting their various therapies. Sometimes we were in a dark hallway down on the 2nd floor of BELP. And so it was really, not the greatest research infrastructure here, but obviously as we've ramped up and now have a dedicated space in CTS Rainbow, it's really changed things quite a bit. Incredibly nice facility. They have infusion bay for patients to get IV therapies. We've also structured our budgets where sometimes I may fluctuate who the coordinator is that's doing those infusions. Sometimes I have a registered nurse who can give the IV infusion. Sometimes I may just have a clinical research coordinator who's not comfortable. And we've, been able to establish a budget where we can actually fluctuate the expenses depending on, what my research personnel is for a given day. And so sometimes we'll have the CTSU staff running the infusions. Sometimes my own team will be doing it. And so it definitely, sometimes helps us keep some costs down if we need to. And they're incredibly wonderful in terms of transitioning as we need them to help with these different studies. Obviously, we have the complete pulmonary function lab, which obviously helps us on the pulmonary side of things, but I know other groups sometimes have studies where they're collecting some spirometry data or other things like that, and that's readily accessible. It's also nice to have all the lab equipment to spin down specimens rather than what used to happen where visit would occur and then you coordinator would have to transport those biospecimens somewhere else in the facility to process them. So now all of that can kind of happen right there in the back of the CTSU Rainbow. So it's created an incredibly easy and comforting environment for patients. And I think it's really, been a huge addition to research here on the main campus at KU.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ham. So we really are trying to offer clinical trial support services across the lifespan. Jill talked about how we are using clinical unit support services for people with Alzheimer's disease on one end of the spectrum. But I think let's move to the other end of the lifespan and figure out how we provide access to these services for children. Jennifer Dolan, could you tell us what's going on over there?
Hi, sure. All right. So the Pediatric Clinical Research Unit at Children's Mercy is located within our inpatient towers here at the Adele Hall campus downtown in Kansas City. We have 6 beds and they are located within 4 rooms. We have one multi-bed room that we use often for siblings, and we can group patients that are like together, either same study or like disease process, or just if they're in and out quick patients. They're all set up like inpatient rooms with recliners. The individual rooms have couches that pull out into beds for parents. They have bathrooms in the rooms, TVs, gaming systems for the kids, and they're very comfortable for families and really nice amenities for them. Our unit also has an exam room, medication room, kitchen, clean soiled utility, nurse's station, and a tube system that connects to the main lab. Also to the clinics, which is nice for coordinators who are collecting research samples in the clinics in various units of the hospital. We have 2 specimen processing labs that are BSL-2 labs within our unit as well. And the research coordinators throughout the hospital that come to our PCRU to process labs fall under the IBC protocol that Dr. Clements and I maintain for the hospital. And within our lab, Dr. Clements, you can advance the slide, please. Within our lab itself, we have a -80 freezer, a -20 freezer, a standard refrigerator, all for biospecimen storage. Most of our storage is just short term. A lot of our investigators have long-term storage other places within our institute, or the samples are shipped out to outside central laboratories. The PCRU does have nurses and a care assistant that we employ for night shift coverage. But unique for the PCRU is that, and for Children's Mercy, is that our coordinators do pretty much everything on their own. So the coordinators come and do all their own procedures. Within our lab itself, we have 6 centrifuges, processing hoods. The unit also, we can do glucose monitoring. We have ECG machines, infusion pumps. We have a Tanita scale. We have gaming systems, again, for children. We have easy access to our hospital's child life department to come down and help facilitate easier transitioning for invasive procedures, or just kiddos who are having a hard time with the procedures that we're doing. We have storage for study supplies upon request. Next slide, please, Dr. Clements. How you work with the PCRU is when you submit your protocol into the IRB system here at Mercy, you would select PCRU as a resource you'd like to use. And our coverage analysis team will help work with the study teams to build this into the budget based on the protocol and the visits that would need to be seen here in the PCRU. Then study teams work with me to schedule individual visits into the unit. And we do all of our scheduling through our EHR and Cerner. And then our study coordinators throughout the hospital and various departments come meet their patients here in the unit. They conduct their visits, their patients go home, and the study coordinators go back to their home department. Study teams that are responsible for all their scheduling, all the necessary tests that would correlate with their visit, whether it be an exam with a physician, MRIs, eye exams that might happen outside of this department, anything like that. Next slide, please. And just some kind of specifics in the breakdown of the PCRU for this year. Our fiscal year is July through June. So these stats are just through April of this year. We have 12 different divisions who utilize this space. As of now, it's definitely gained through this month, but as of April, 62 different protocols who are utilizing this space. And I did break this down. We do have, of those 62, 18 of them are NIH funded. 31 are industry trials and 13 are either interdepartmentally funded, foundation, or grant funded, just other grants. So our NIH funding is roughly 29% of the protocols. Some of the unique things we've seen over the years in our unit, for 6 beds, it's pretty nice to see the different diversity that we've had come through the unit. We've had clamp studies that have come through. We do quite a bit of developmental testing and observational studies for that. We've done metabolic testing. We do a very large amount of investigational drugs and devices. We do a lot of PK studies, a lot of which end up being overnight in 12 hours, 18-hour PKs. We do vaccine trials. And yeah, a lot of our visits are very quick in and out. But again, we see a lot of traffic through here with a lot of different staff. So it's a busy unit.
That's great. You actually covered one of my questions, which was whether or not you did overnight studies. It sounds like that's actually a fairly large volume of what you do.
We do. Yeah, our hospital administration has asked that we kind of limit our overnight population to the age out of the specific department that's working with it. So I'll give the example of endocrine, which Dr. Clements can speak to. He's had overnight studies in the unit, and age out for endocrine at our hospital is age 21. So we capped our overnight age population for recruitment at 21. So that's what we would see them in the hospital as an inpatient. So, you know, we work with those parameters for safety reasons, but yeah, overnights, and we have the staff to do that now. So other than that, yeah, it's been great.
Well, and you've already alluded to our next presenter, who also happens to be excellent at actually advancing slides for other speakers. I'd like to introduce Dr. Mark Clements, Professor of Pediatrics at University of Missouri, Kansas City, and Children's Mercy Hospital in the Division of Endocrinology. So Dr. Clements.
Yeah, thank you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about our TrialNet research program and how we have leveraged the unit at Children's Mercy. And I think it's an excellent example of a program because we actually recruit people up to age 45 into this. And so there are opportunities for us to take on studies that would utilize the facilities in Fairway or at the Rainbow campus, as well as in Children's Mercy and potentially even in Wichita. So let's see if I can advance my own slides. So who is TrialNet? TrialNet's an international network of institutions and researchers that are trying to prevent type 1 diabetes. And it's funded by the National Institutes of Health. It offers screening for relatives of people with type 1 diabetes and offers innovative clinical studies to try to preserve endogenous insulin production. So if you think about it, it's a really interesting program because it is offering people who are on the surface well, they do not have a chronic disease by our current definitions, and it is offering them immune modulating therapies to try to prevent them from developing an autoimmune condition that affects beta cell function and insulin production. And then the goal is try to stop disease progression both before and after diagnosis. So you'll see some studies that are starting to impact clinical care post-diagnosis for type 1 diabetes. So it begins with this type 1 diabetes disease progression study called Pathway to Prevention. I'll just comment to you that the entire program is based on screening in clinic, and we're not screening our patients with type 1 diabetes, we're screening their relatives. Recognizing that relatives have to have a 15-fold greater risk of developing type 1 diabetes relative to the general population. So they become an enriched pool of individuals for this prevention research. And as they progress through immune activation and develop an immune response, they first reach stage 1 of type 1 diabetes, which is where they have 2 or more autoantibodies against the beta cells. And then they'll progress to stage 2, where they have abnormal blood sugars, and eventually stage 3, where they develop what we often consider the clinical diagnosis of type 1 diabetes. And then stage 4 is longstanding disease. And this is important to understand, because 5 years ago, we just thought of type 1 diabetes as existing in one stage. We have now changed the clinical definition, and somebody actually has the disease back when their blood sugars are normal and they have autoantibodies present. Which can happen, of course, years before clinical onset. So as I mentioned, in the general population, in the US, the risk is 1 out of 300. This varies in populations across the world. The risk in family members of individuals with type 1 diabetes is 1 out of 20. This is an example of how our clinical care interacts with the CTSU at Children's Mercy in a very significant way, because we are actively identifying families from our clinical encounters and then referring them to studies in the PCRU at Children's Mercy. We screen in the TrialNet program. So Children's Mercy is one of the 16 clinical centers leading this global network of over 200 centers. And we screen 150,000 relatives of people with type 1 diabetes so far, and about currently 15 to 19,000 people per year. Across all of the centers. So I'm going to skip through here and just mention that, where we're doing a lot of our research for prevention is in stage 1 and stage 2. These are the individuals that we're identifying. It is notable that children do progress to stage 3 disease faster than adults. That's one of the things that the research has taught us. It is important for us to understand the staging, because it provides a framework for regulators and funders to think about how to fund this research. We can lead to a decreased risk of diabetic ketoacidosis at diagnosis, which can affect multiple organ function, including function of the brain. And so if we can prevent DKA, that's actually an example of one of the few research studies that has a clinical benefit when you participate. And then we can design trials around preventing progression to stage 2 or stage 3. What are some of the interventions? So I mentioned that we screen, relatives for autoantibodies. This happens in the clinics and out at community events. Happens in the entire region, coordinated by the Children's Mercy team. Relatives age 1 to 45 with a sibling, child, or parent with type 1 qualify. Individuals age 1 to 20 with a sibling, child, parent, cousin, uncle, aunt, niece, nephew, or grandparent with T1D qualify. We have these immune interventions that we're offering in the clinical trial unit. So you can see several of them are immune modulating drugs that are given either orally or via IV infusion at stage 1. We have used teplizumab, anti-CD3 at stage 2 when people have some abnormal glucose tolerance. We have also done a study on anti-thymocyte globulin, which was given at stage 3. This has happened in the entire network of TrialNet, and there are follow-up studies for anti-thymocyte globulin coming. But how does this relate to our functions in the research unit? We commonly use oral glucose tolerance testing in these studies, because that is, of course, how one clinically defines progression to abnormal glucose tolerance and to stage 3 diabetes diagnosis. And we also use mixed meal tolerance tests to measure the C-peptide response to a boost shake. That area under the curve for C-peptide is what's used to model the preservation of beta cell function. It is the best measure we have today of functional residual beta cell mass in type 1 diabetes. I also want to point out, as Jen alluded to, that some of our other non-trial net beta cell studies happening in the Diabetes Center have utilized additional tests that are somewhat specialized. So we do hyperglycemic clamps, we do arginine potentiated clamps, we do hyperinsulinemic, euglycemic, and hypoglycemic clamps in the unit. And we've done all of these successfully. And some of these are very long protocols that can require staffing and presence of the participant for 30 to 36 hours in a row. For those who didn't know about TrialNet before they're hearing this today, there is a website that one can go to identify how to participate. I'd be happy to take any questions at the end of this session today or by email. And I thank you for your time. I'll just mention briefly again, we have not utilized the adult centers in TrialNet, but because we are screening people who are up to age 45, we think that it's an excellent opportunity with our participation in the CTSA to leverage this global research program to show how these units can work together to implement protocols.
Yeah, that would be fascinating. Thank you. That was great. I think our last speaker, our panelist today is actually on the road. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Mario Castro.
Thanks, Ed, and thank you all for joining me. This is called CTSU on wheels, literally. So just another function that we can do. We can do it on the road. I think Laura has already touched upon the CTSU at Fairway. Just wanted to touch upon our CTSU at Rainbow on campus and turn it over to Mark Hamlin to talk about it from his perspective as an investigator. CTSU Rainbow is complementary to CTSU at Fairway in that we are set up to really be conduct studies that require access to the immediate hospital surroundings. So that certainly is facilitated there. Patients that have higher acuity can certainly be done at CTSU Rainbow because of that access to the hospital. And certainly there are tests that sometimes we need in our protocol that you can only get through the health system, through the hospital. And this would be an ideal location for them. I think some of the other unique things of CTSU Rainbow is that we do have a complete pulmonary function lab that has ability to measure lung function by both spirometry and body plethysmography or lung volumes, measurement of diffusion capacity, and measurement of exhaled nitric oxide. So those services are uniquely available at CTSU Rainbow. And we are also able to do the usual things that Fairway does, like injections and infusions and monitoring the patients within the Rainbow site. The other thing that we do have capacity that's unique at CTSU Rainbow is we have a negative pressure room within the DELP location. That negative pressure room we've been heavily utilizing with our COVID outpatient study called Active 2. And we arrange for the patients to come in through a separate entrance and right into our CTSU there on ground DELP. And that allowed us to do these studies that we ultimately could have not done without that specialized capacity. In both our Sudler site and our DELP site, we have capacity to process biospecimens and keep the biospecimens there for the study team for a short period of time until they're able to ship it or subsequently get it processed. I'm going to ask Mark to go ahead and.
I think
come
Mark
on
already
with
gave
me.
his presentation, so I think you missed it.
Oh,
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
probably while you were
Good,
getting on the
good.
road there. So
Yeah, so
All right.
it's great.
Thank
And
you.
actually, I think Laura also did some of, you recaptured some of the same things that Laura actually brought out about some of the unique resources at Fairway versus Rainbow CTSUs. We could probably open it up for some questions now to our panelist here who can talk with you about CTSU capacity at Rainbow, Fairway, at Children's Mercy, maybe even on the road, as Mario's talking about it. Clearly, our clinical research units have gotten a lot of, have played a critical role in response to COVID, both with clinical trials, COVID-related clinical trials, and in vaccine testing. Laura, could you clarify a little bit? You showed that one URL about how to register for CRU support. Where do we find that information? What's the first step?
Well, at Frontiers, we have a website on, the CTSU is under Frontiers. So on the Frontiers, there's a clinical translational science unit tab. And in there, we have those similar, we have the link that would be to the form. And I'll throw that in the chat for people so that they can see where to go to access that, Ed.
That would be great. Thank you so much. I'm trying to look in the chat to see. Anybody have any questions that they would like to ask? I was looking at the comments that Dr. Clements was putting into the chat. Yeah, so, Dr. Clements, I actually did have questions very specifically about, you cast out this idea that even us general internists might be able to participate in this program with adults up to age 45. So tell us a little bit more about what types of adults could potentially fit into this work.
So if the adult has a first degree relative with type 1 diabetes, then and there's a definition of what that looks like. So basically, somebody who started insulin shortly after diagnosis, prior to the age of 40 in the family, then they qualify to get screened for their risk for type 1 diabetes. And it takes about 6 weeks to get the autoantibody results back. And if they end up being one of the 5% of family members who will be positive for autoantibodies, we then approach them about any of the ongoing clinical trials for which they qualify. And, I didn't mention it in the talk for the sake of time, but I did mention in the chat that, teplizumab was actually, those results were published in a New England Journal of Medicine article. And that drug is now under consideration by the FDA for the treatment of individuals at risk for type 1 diabetes, which is very exciting to see. And we've had 2 other therapies that have been shown to delay or alter the loss of beta cell function in people at risk for type 1. So again, very exciting to see multiple lines of evidence coming out of this work that it is possible to alter the course of the disease.
Sounds great. I guess my naive view on this had been that once I was over the age of 21, I really didn't have a high risk for type 1 diabetes.
Oh, yeah. So this is interesting.
Anymore.
Yeah, so there's actually evidence that comes out of the UK that 40% of individuals diagnosed with type 1 diabetes are diagnosed after the age of 30. In the past, many of us may have considered LADA, latent autoimmune diabetes of the adult, to be a distinct entity from type 1 diabetes, but they're now considered to be the same entity. And we simply know that individuals who are diagnosed later in life have more residual beta cell function. And it is thought that quite a few people who are diagnosed with type 2 diabetes as adults and might be started on oral medications for a period of time may actually have type 1 diabetes, but are missed because it's not autoantibody testing is not routinely performed. It's possible that up to 5% of people diagnosed with type 2 could have type 1.
And I'm sorry, Dr. Clemens, for keeping you on the spot, but you hit on a lot of key issues here. One of the things we are trying to do across all of our centers is expand diversity of recruitment, particularly racial, ethnic diversity into our studies. Can you mention anything about unique issues for your trials as it relates to race and ethnicity, and any successes or challenges that you've had in bringing those individuals into the CRU?
Yeah, I will say that it is priority at Children's Mercy in general to increase diversity in participation in clinical trials. In the work that I do with type 1 diabetes, there's a little bit of a unique challenge because there is a propensity for non-Hispanic white to be the greatest incidence in the U.S. So it just increases our responsibility to try to make sure that minority groups that are even less commonly affected get represented well enough that we understand the course of the disease in them. We have a number of other studies, for instance, in type 2 diabetes, where there is a propensity for African American and Hispanic families to be affected disproportionately, where it becomes extremely important for us to have culturally appropriate advertising, that we have our consent forms and our advertisements translated into Spanish, that we have staff who can communicate in the primary language about the study. Otherwise, we wouldn't reach those families who are disproportionately affected by the disease. So are we having successes? I think we are having some. But it really takes time to achieve that, because you have to go through the processes to make sure that you've got staff who are dedicated to inclusion and diversity and are thinking about all these issues at every step of the way during protocol development and protocol execution from the very beginning.
And Laura put in a very important comment in the chat in an effort to expand access to our clinical translational science unit resources. We are in the process of trying to put CTSU facilities adjacent to Swope Health off of Blue Parkway. So that would be great. That builds on a lot of the long-standing research experience there with the Kick It at Swope series of trials. Dr. Morris, I wondered if you could just comment briefly about staffing issues for your research studies. As you were trying to price and negotiate your studies with the clinical trials unit, were you doing a lot of the staffing yourself, or how much did you take advantage of their staff there? Any challenges or lessons learned from that work?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that I've done both. I think it depends on, if it is how early on in the game you get the actual pricing done. If it's an R01 study that you have worked with the CTSU early on the budget, I think that that's really important, because you can leverage more of the resources. For pilot studies, we tend to do more things ourselves because it is a lot more, it's a lot cheaper to do that. And if you have the staff to do it and they're trained, we do that a lot, especially for our smaller studies. But, for the bigger studies, we have also used, CTSU nursing staff.
I think there's some real advantages because they have all their own standard operating procedures in place already that they can readily adapt. And but I thank you for pointing that out. Make sure to contact them and get your budget estimates before you submit your R01 application. Absolutely critical. I think I'm not getting any questions in the chat. Dr. Castro, any closing comments or thoughts that you had that we needed to cover for the Frontiers community?
No, thank you for highlighting this. I think the exciting thing that I envision with all of our CTSUs now aligned is that investigators that have a multi-center project can actually launch this across our locations in geographically dispersed areas with diverse involvement from multiple populations. So I think it's an exciting time for moving our research forward at KUMC, that we have this opportunity to align across multiple centers. Thanks, Ed, for highlighting.
Well, I'd like to thank all of our panelists. Laura, thanks for all those references that you've put into the chat and the links. Jennifer, thanks for showing us what you have at Children's Mercy. That's absolutely beautiful facilities. Dr. Morris, Dr. Clements, Dr. Hamlin, really appreciate the case use scenarios that you have. I apologize if as a general internist, I got really caught up into the diabetes realm. It's part of my daily life. So really appreciate everybody's contribution here today, and really hope that everybody in the audience will think about taking advantage of our CRU resources here. I think they can really make conducting your research a lot easier. Ashley Carlson, thank you for hosting here. She once again says to get your CEU credit, type the code into EAD. And we'll look forward to seeing you again when we talk about entrepreneurship at our June Research and Discovery Grand Rounds. Thanks everybody for coming and participating today.